Can't get enough of Kelly and Ramya?
We're now on YouTube for you to indulge in highlights from our show.
Last year, author and architect David Gissen wrote a book titled The Architecture of Disability, and it was subtitled Building Cities and Landscapes Beyond Access. As well as knowing architecture, Mr. Gissen knows what it's like to be disabled as an above-the-knee amputee. In his book, he says it's time for a brand new rethinking of architecture when it comes to people with disabilities, beyond meeting the letter of the law when it comes to accessibility regulations. I think a lot of us can nod our heads at that sentiment, and we're going to be reaching Mr. David Gissen in New York. Thank you for coming on Kelly and Ramya.
So much for having me. I'm very excited to talk to you about my new book.
I know, it's very unfortunate we only have like 15 minutes with you. There's so much to get into. You mentioned in your book that at one time you believed that accessible design strategies belittle people with disabilities. How do you say so?
Well, I think we can do more. For example, a lot of buildings or architects of buildings simply think that if they provide curb cuts and the sidewalks in front of buildings or elevators inside of their buildings, that they've somehow solved the problem of disabled use. And I think disabled people have a lot more to offer to how we think about buildings and cities and landscapes beyond just whether a building is accessible to them or not.
It's always interesting to if you speak to someone who's a designer, and I guess getting your head around it, recognizing the importance of accessibility, but also how that can be so a part of that design and not take from it. And I don't know how much you ran into hearing that out there, David, but how would you currently describe accessibility's place in our current modern architecture?
Yeah, well, let me give you some examples of from the book and what I'm talking about. So, and we can talk about how someone like me moves around a city like New York City, how somebody like me uses buildings, and some other ways we might think about buildings from the perspective of disability that are beyond access. So, for example, when I walk from my apartment to where I teach at the Parsons School of Design in New York City, a lot of times I pass these curb cuts that are in every sidewalk and enable people who are primarily wheelchair using, but also blind people to move more easily from the sidewalk to the street and back up the sidewalk. But one of the questions we never ask ourselves is, why do cities have such a strong physical distinction between sidewalks and streets in the first place? There are many people right now who are trying to rethink city streets and sidewalks from the perspective of environmentalism and water movement in cities, which has become a real issue with climate change and increased rain, particularly in cities in North America. And so I don't think disabled people are involved in those conversations. And those environmentalists, architects, and urbanists are really rethinking that strong distinction between streets and sidewalks, which they say is actually very poor in terms of water management. We need to rethink how curbs work and how sewers work. And I think disabled people can be involved in those distinctions. For example, in those conversations, I was in Florida recently in a new town that was planned, which didn't have any physical distinction between the level of the sidewalk and the level of the street. So it was a city without curbs. So that's an example. So, but that was actually a positive thing because it enabled a lot more mobility. You didn't feel as if like you were going to get hit by a car or anything. Similarly, in a place like New York City, many of the buildings are multi-story buildings. And one thing I talk about in my book is that in recent history, and really since skyscrapers have been constructed en masse in North American cities, that these are some of the most disabling buildings. So what do I mean by that? So if you're a career construction worker, if you work in the field of building buildings your entire life, you have a greater chance of sustaining an injury in that profession than any other profession in the United States. That's something that we don't hear disabled people talk about with the construction of buildings, and the risks go up for each level and height that a building is built. So again, these are things that are typically outside the politics of disability and architecture, but I think those of us like myself who are disabled and who are very interested in the politics of disability and architecture need to have a much more comprehensive view over whether or not someone like myself who's relatively privileged can move around a building easily or not through the kinds of parameters around access and accessibility.
Yeah, and I hear you on the level of when we were talking there about even sidewalk road. As a blind person, I know for myself locally we have a road like that, and you want to put down things so you know the transition from one to the other, and you just wonder how much of that. And if we were in those conversations, like you say, that would just be a done deal. It would be a great solution for access as long as winter and summer you could distinguish that. So I'm always curious, but I think, like you say, that's where it starts with those inclusion conversations.
Yeah, exactly. And as long as we're talking about sidewalks and streets, another thing that I mentioned is that in the wake of the COVID-19 epidemic, so many of us feel as if we need to build rest into our everyday lives. And I think I live in a city, New York City, where I can't think of anywhere in the city where I can find a public park bench that's actually on a
Right,
sidewalk. They
right.
exist in the parks, but just a place for people to rest. So if you're an older person and you're in a city like New York where people are always on the move and you're competing against other people walking down the street, that having a place where you can sit at a corner, at a stoplight or at a particularly long block like we have on avenues, that would be a great benefit to the public. And again, these are things that are outside access and accessibility laws in the United States, but that are really important features of a city that's made for disabled and elderly citizens in particular.
When you talk about New York City, of course, those of us here in Toronto or other major urban
Yep.
areas can definitely relate, physical barriers to people with disabilities. But I'm very curious about the things you touch on in the book around accessibility when it comes to historic landmarks, because you have some
Mm.
personal experience with that as well and some opinions to follow, obviously. So can you just describe to us your experience navigating the Acropolis in Athens, Greece?
Yeah, okay, thank you for bringing that up. That was actually one of the inspirations for this book.
Oh,
So a long
yeah.
time ago.
I
Yeah,
can
yeah, for a long,
understand that.
yeah.
I can
So
understand it as I read it.
yeah, yeah. So I went through just to give you some background. So I became an amputee when I was 19 years old. So when I was in architecture school, and as a result of pediatric bone cancer, which I was diagnosed with in high school. So I really went through my entire career as an architect as an amputee.
Mm.
And one of the things that happens when you're an architecture student is that you go visit historic buildings and you're encouraged to visit historic buildings. And so I went to the Acropolis, like I was fortunate enough to be able to go there. And I walked up the Acropolis as so many other architects had before me. And I was very disturbed by the experience. I would say that not only was it arduous and difficult and impossible to navigate, but they also had this access elevator at the time that was built on the north face of the Acropolis, excuse me, that was like a rickety construction elevator that one person could fit in
Mm.
and that you were told you could go in if you had a serious mobility disability. That was actually built for the Olympics that was staged in Athens, and I think it was 2004, but don't quote me on that. Um, so after visiting the actual Acropolis site, I went to the Acropolis Museum, and lo and behold, there was a model of the Acropolis as it looked 2,500 years ago. And I did not know this at the time, but the Acropolis 2,500 years ago had an enormous ramp that connected it to the base of the Acropolis that
Huh.
people used to walk up. And there was actually discussion and very ancient statuary that depicted very elderly people and young people going up this ramp to the Acropolis. So there's a building. I'm not saying the Acropolis was accessible by contemporary standards 2,500 years ago.
Oh,
I don't want people
but
to
there was
misunderstand.
something. Yeah.
Yes, and
Uh,
that the fact that it's so and I think one of the things that I learned after going there and studying this, that the inaccessibility of the site was something that was actually built into it in the
Right.
20th century to kind of create this romantic experience of seeing a ruin and really supporting people's romantic ideas of what it means to explore ancient history that somehow we imagine should be arduous or difficult, which it wasn't 2,500 years ago. So that made a very big impression on me, the entire experience and
mhm.
the history of that space. And one of
So,
the things I talk about, oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
no, no, you go ahead. Finish your thought.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I talk about is that we really need to resurrect these histories that are within architecture history that talk about how people that were elderly or who by today's standards, we would say we're disabled, move through the landscapes and buildings of the historic past, because disabled people have been around forever. And the problems, let's say, of disability are not new. And so many of the buildings and spaces that we may know from architectural history are spaces that actually have disability histories within them. They just take a little bit more work to coax out and to learn about.
It's interesting because you think maybe then the viewpoint of those older people, the learnedness or whatever respect was given for them, it was just a no-brainer that they're going to be there in public utilizing, and we have to think of them. Can we think about, when it comes to a governing body, how far could we go to make something like the Leaning Tower of Pisa or the Eiffel Tower more accessible these days?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about that so much. I'll say this, like a lot of times when I visit an important historic monument, like the Eiffel Tower or like Pisa or these others, like I realize that it's not going to be easy for me to move up that space if it doesn't have an elevator, but I appreciate when I can have an experience of the space remotely. So that can be in a museum at the base of a building or some other way to experience it that may not be the experience of going to the top, but that's nonetheless a meaningful experience for me. And I'll speak for myself. I'm actually fine with that. And I think that's actually, in a way, I think if more people had an experience of historic monuments like that, they would probably be more easy to conserve and preserve because the foot traffic through them wouldn't be so intense. So I'm okay with these. People sometimes use the word remote experiences where you're not actually able to have the kind of full and comprehensive experience inside of a building. I'm okay with that. But another thing, just to add to that, another thing that I like is I like to bring my own disability experiences to spaces. So I had an experience recently where I was visiting a medieval pilgrimage cathedral in France. Again, felt very fortunate to be able to travel there. And this is a space that has been accommodating disabled people for over 1,000 years. I mean, people 1,000 years ago came to spaces like this to pray to relics, to worship, and to think and contend with their own impairments in many cases. There's images in stained glass of people that are blind and people that had other kinds of very serious impairments. And I think somebody can really revive, again, the kind of histories of disability in a space like that and make it meaningful for people like us, because people like us have been traveling to a space like that for almost 1,000 years. So yeah, I think that's very important.
I guess it's really that the conversations themselves weren't passed down enough for the sentiment to continue living, and now we're kind of trying to revive the conversations altogether to bring people with disabilities back in, which is, you know, infuriating to say the least. But honestly, incredible read, and thank you so much for coming on the show. We have to wrap here, but hopefully we can have a follow-up conversation with you, David. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I love what you guys are doing, and really appreciate the chance to talk about this book.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck with the book, David.
Thanks for watching.
You can catch Kelly and Ramya weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern on AMI.